Welcome, everybody, to this week's lesson in our series, Was This God's Idea? The series on creation account of Genesis. We have looked at young earth creationism and old earth creationism. This week, we look at evolutionary creationism. So, evolutionary creationism is also known as theistic evolution. And the claim right off the bat is a both and claim. It is the one position that says evolution is real, the Bible is true. Those two statements can both be factual at the same time. Statistically speaking, one of the things they will argue is that there are many more Christians who deny evolution than non-religious people or people who have no affiliation with any faith system. And they say that this is a problem because there are youth that are leaving the church at an alarming rate. And many say when they leave the church and leave their faith that it's because it's incompatible with science. So evolutionary creationists or theistic evolutionists see their position as an answer for people who face that dilemma. So they would argue that God created the universe, the earth, and life over billions of years. The gradual process of evolution was crafted and governed by God, and it results in the diversity of life that we have today. Now, this position is believed by a lot of different people. The organization or the viewpoint that we're going to highlight here is that of BioLogos. BioLogos was founded by Francis Collins, who was initially a physician and then, and a geneticist, who is known very well because he directed and had the visionary leadership for the Human Genome Project as he took over as the director of the National Institutes of Health. But he founded BioLogos, and we are going to hear from Deborah Harzma in this lesson in terms of her writings are what I'm basing this lesson off of, and her explanation of the evolutionary creationist view. As I said, it's also known as theistic evolution, and they would contend that it's been accepted by prominent Christians all along over the years, and a couple of examples that they highlight are C.S. Lewis and Billy Graham. All right, so we have this claim, evolution is real and the Bible is true, both at the same time. So God uses both nature and scripture to reveal himself to us with full authority. However, both of those things, nature and scripture, are subject to human interpretation, which means they are subject to error. And so we also have to understand that the Bible was originally written for a different audience. This is very important to the evolutionary creationist position. The Bible was written for us, but it was not written to us. So as a book early on that's by Israelites for Israelites, we need to consider that they viewed the world differently. And so the writings that we see in Genesis took that into consideration and was written in a context that they could understand at that time. So this image that you have here on the screen is what they would say was the view of many ancient Near East cultures. So it was shared by the Egyptians and the Babylonians as well. And there's this view of a flat earth with a dome basically over it. And you kind of had the waters below and then this flat earth and then the waters above. And with the sky in there, kind of like a layered effect. It was different from others. The Israelites and what you have in Genesis did differ from others in that there was only one God and all else is created. There's not a sun who is a God or air that is God, sea that is God, and all of that. So there's not these wars between gods as we see it in the Bible. And humans are made in the image of God, not as lowly slaves. So there's lots of evidence that they claim backs up their position, and we're going to go through that. But we're going to start with the creationism piece of this, so the evolutionary creationism, because they do highlight this is a Christian viewpoint again. So this is a camp that is saying there is a divine creator, there is a higher power. And they would take evidence like the parameters of the universe because they see that there's just so much fine tuning that's in place. And clearly there's a higher power who must have precisely set these parameters for human existence. An example that they would give is the strength of gravity. But all of this fine tuning, they say, makes all these things possible: star formation, carbon, and of course, life. The extravagance of the universe is another claim that they would make. Just the fact that we have so many different galaxies and that we are one of billions of galaxies uh, as well. So now let's move into the different forms of evidence that they say back up the evolutionary part of this as well. And we're going to start with the old Earth piece, that they say that there's a lot of time to make all of this possible. So starting with geology, an example would be the ice layers and glaciers that have been counted back over 100,000 years in Greenland and Antarctica. The sedimentary rock layers that form at the bottom of lakes and seas show them that millions of years of deposits have been preserved and hardened into rock. So that's evidence for them. Radiometric dating, of course, is what they would rely on heavily as well, because the known half-life of decay is available. And so, like using the example of potassium argon dating, that shows that some rock formations to be billions of years old, because the half-life of potassium 40 is 1.3 billion years. So again, with this evidence claim, they move to another area, and that's astronomy. So the speed of light, in case you don't know, is really, really, really super fast. And so that they use that as the evidence to talk about the age of the Earth and the size of the universe. It takes 8 minutes, a little over 8 minutes, to get from the sun to the Earth with light. And it takes 2.5 million years to get from the Andromeda galaxy to us. Not only does that indicate a huge, large, old universe, but it's a universe that they say is expanding, and you can use the expansion rate as we observe it to determine that the universe has been expanding from more than 13 billion years, because it started out being close together and now has been spread out. Then they move to genetics as well. So they would argue that chimps and humans are very similar. And so chimpanzees have 24 chromosomes, humans have 23. And the hypothesis here is that two chromosomes fused in the line that became humans and did not fuse in the line that stayed as chimpanzees. So on this diagram here, something to consider that they say is very important is that you have this centromere, this center piece here, of the chromosome, which is critical to cell division. And then at the ends, you have what's called a telomere. And it's kind of like the end of a shoelace, how we have that piece on the end of the shoelace to protect it, to keep it from fraying. It's kind of like a protective cap on the end of it. So with that idea in mind of the chromosome, the argument that they make is that, as it comes up on the screen, sorry, humans have an extra telomere sequence and an extra centromeric sequence, which shows that they were fused together, indicating common ancestry. And if you want to pause this video and look at the diagram across the top, which is a depiction of that, you can. So moving on to more evidence that they say backs up their position, continuing with genetics. Humans are remarkably similar. We are one family. But we emerged as a population, not from two individuals. So there's just too much variation, they say, to contend that we all came from Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve could have existed, but they might have been pulled out as two historical examples among many, or they might have been pulled out as an example and more recently, like within the last 6,000 years. Or it could be that they are non-historical figures that are just part of a symbolic story. And there's theologians in all camps, which would fall under the umbrella of evolutionary creationism. So you have people that have all different perspectives within this position. Still continuing with what they say is more evidence. Deborah Harzma, who I said is what I'm basing this on, says, quote, "There is strong scientific consensus on evolution and little debate over the common ancestry of life." So their argument is basically this is a settled matter as far as science is concerned. Any debate over this is really about the how, the mechanics of evolution, not if. And again, they would state that there's similarities between humans and chimps and gorillas, and even looking at the anatomy. And the fossil record also, they say, would argue that gradual transition can be seen over time for several species towards bipedal walking, greater height, and bigger brains. It's important, they would contend, that we have some understanding in their terms of how evolution works. Of course, you have this driving factor of natural selection, and in every generation within a species, offspring differ slightly from their parents. Sometimes these differences give a reproductive advantage to those with certain traits in that environment. And over time and successive generations, these traits work their way through the population. Now, evolutionary creationism is one camp, according to Harzma, that is going to break down this distinction, as I mentioned earlier in the series, between microevolution and macroevolution. And so, as our previous camps looked at that, they might agree with microevolution, but not macroevolution. But this camp is actually highlighting these two because they support both views. So microevolution is this idea that you can have part of a population that may become isolated somehow. So an example they give is birds going to a different island. And in that unique ecological environment that will favor some traits over others, it will cause some genes to be selected over time. And now what you have is the isolated group is distinct from the original group, and that can result in a recognition of a new species. But then you have this idea of macroevolution, where you have the driver of natural selection and the evolutionary mechanisms over long periods of time that result in major changes to body structures. So you do see that gradual change from a common ancestor from one species to another over time. They would argue that it's important to understand that in evolution, we need to understand that it happens in groups. While it may begin with individuals or couples, it happens in groups over time. It takes a long time, and randomness is definitely a part of it. So there's a lot of arguments against evolution because of the randomness piece, and they have no problem saying randomness is absolutely a part of it. But the evolutionary process does rely on random genetic variation, but also the non-random process of selection. Now, again, remember, theistic evolutionists might differ from other evolutionists because they are acknowledging that there's a higher power or a God, a divine being involved in the process. And they want to be clear that random does not need to equate to unpredictable or meaningless. They acknowledge that there are some doctrinal questions and challenges that are raised by their view. For example, the image of God. It's hard to know how to interpret that. Should that be interpreted as physically we're made in the image of God, intellectually, spiritually, or just in our relational capacity? Because they contend that really, in the end, we may not be all that different from animals. Another issue is the idea or doctrine of original sin that some hold, because that doctrine is intertwined with the historical idea of Adam and Eve. And then the idea of death before sin, which we saw with the old earth creationists as well, that they believe there was death before sin and it had to be animal death. And the fossil record clearly shows that it did exist prior to human death. So they would say the answer to that is that references to death in Genesis must be interpreted as meaning only spiritual and only referring to humans. And then finally, this idea of natural evil or suffering that exists in the world is definitely a part of it. And we've talked about this before. With the drivers and mechanisms in place for evolution, you do have suffering, you have death, and even extinction of creatures along the way. So they contend that some of the suffering may actually be part of God's original creation, and that ultimately the evolutionary process actually reduces suffering in some ways as it allows species to adapt and survive in new environments. So in conclusion, to wrap this up, one of the key points that this camp makes is the idea of cooperation. Cooperation is key to understanding evolution, and it's actually the main theme of evolution as you move from single cell to multi-cell, individual behavior to social behavior, asexual to sexual. And as these transitions and progress is made over time, cooperation is actually the key component to keep in mind when you're thinking of evolution. So that wraps up the evolutionary creationism or theistic evolution camp. Again, you can reflect and discuss what you see as the strengths and weaknesses of this position. What questions did it raise and what questions did it answer for you? Thanks so much for listening and watching this. Have a great day.